guy's still
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is John Carter, and my job here tonight is to introduce the lecturer for the 2018 Dr. Merrill Gaddis Memorial Lecture. Before I do that, though, I'm obliged to tell you a little bit about the lecture itself. Dr. Merrill Gaddis is one of the foundational academic figures in the history of Central Methodist University. He came here from the University of Chicago in the late 1920s, 1929, I believe, and stayed at Central throughout his teaching career, lived right down the street here for 30 years, and in that time led the department, what was then the Department of History and Political Science. He's a renowned lecturer. He taught thousands of Central students in the required sequences in American history and the fledgling courses that were just beginning to be offered in the 20s in the discipline that would become my own, political science. In 1984, we established the Gaddis Lecture as a way of honoring his memory. And on the program for tonight's presentation on the back, you'll see a roll of the Central alumni who have presented the Gaddis Lecture over the years. It's quite an esteemed group, and tonight's lecturer will join those ranks comfortably. Chris Janssen came to Central Methodist University. Was it Central Methodist University?
Yes.
Yeah,
first year.
Just had become Central Methodist University in 2005. He was one of my political science majors, an exceptional student as an undergraduate. He was a leader in Pi Gamma Mu. We just had our initiation banquet tonight. He led that organization for the last two years as vice president and president, I believe. Chris was also an athlete. He was an academic All-American on the Central Methodist University Eagles, tight end throughout his time with us. And as a graduating senior, he was the recipient of the 2009 Judge Andrew Jackson Higgins Award for Excellence in Pre-Law Studies. After his time at Central, he went on to earn a master's degree in public policy. I'm sure he's going to tell you about that, so I don't want to step on his delivery. And to work in legislative politics as a legislative staff person, and today as a lobbyist. And he's one of our renowned young alumni. And it's my very great pleasure to give you Chris Janssen.
So thank you, everybody. I appreciate the fantastic attendance we have here. Before, I know this is a little bit unorthodox, so as I signed back in, I didn't want Dr. Carter sitting down quite yet. My wife Lauren and I, we moved into our house in Columbia a few years ago, and I found a box that I was unpacking that said CMU stuff, so it was appropriately titled. And Dr. Carter, he helped me out quite a bit throughout my time here at Central, helping out preparing for tests, preparing for papers. And in his office, we were sitting down one day, and he handed me a book to help out with one of my papers. And I vividly remember this book, Congress, The Electoral Connection by David R. Mayhew. Essentially what that did was, this book outlined that once a person is elected to Congress, their primary goal, it seems, whether it's for their actions back in the district or legislatively, their primary goal is to get reelected. So that's that electoral connection. And so as I was unpacking this box, you can see here in red writing, it says Carter at the bottom. So Dr. Carter, after a decade in my possession, I'd like to give this back to you, and for a little bit of interest that I owe for you, I got you I know you just like to spend time at Emmett's, so I got you a little gift card as interest. So here's your book back.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So once again, as I sign in here, hopefully, there we go. Like I said, it's a pleasure to be back here on campus. I always get fond memories coming back here. My wife Lauren and I were just back here for homecoming, and the changes are incredible. The changes are incredible. So many buildings that have been renovated. We got to tour Stedman Hall. You guys have no idea, if you were freshmen, how fantastic that building is. It's changed the landscape of the outside of the building and then inside the building. With all those glass walls, though, I don't know if I'd be able to focus in there. If someone walked by, I'd be, looking over all the time. But anyway, so real quick, the ongoing joke. It's already been mentioned multiple times, and I saw the sign-in sheet outside. Raise your hand for me if you are only here. If you're only here, I know it's midterm week, for extra credit. Raise your hand. Be proud. All right. Awesome. So I hope to make this painless for you. You probably have no idea who I am or what this, other than the title of the lecture, what the heck it's going to be about. So like I said, I'll make this painless for you. So first off, I'd like to thank Dr. Cherry. I've got a couple of thanks here, but I'd like to thank Dr. Cherry for inviting me to be the guest lecturer. For a bit of context, this is the 35th annual Gaddis lecture, so a bit of context. I was born during the third installment of this lecture series. So for those of you students that are here, yes, I'm getting older. For those of you that were here during those first 3 years, I'm sorry if I just made you feel even more older than you already are. I'd also like to give a quick shout out to a couple of my former classmates. Both, they're not here tonight, but Seth Bauman and Christine Thompson-Shutt. They both were classmates of mine, and in the prior 2 years, if you look at the back of your pamphlet here, they gave the lecture in 2017 and 2016. And unknowingly, they kind of gave me the confidence to stand before you today and be able to give this lecture. They gave me a little bit of inspiration. Further, I'd like to thank Dr. Bradley for the nomination here. I'll tell a funny Dr. Bradley story here a little bit later as I get into my lecture a little bit, but to give you a little bit of insight of how shocked I was when I received the invitation, I was like, is there another Chris Janssen that graduated from Central Methodist that I'm unaware of? But it turns out it was me, and so here we are. Next, I'd like to thank Pi Gamma Mu for continuing putting on this lecture series, and congratulate the newest members that were just inducted at the dinner earlier. It's a great honor, and you were certainly among some of the brightest in your selected disciplines. And then last, I'd like to thank my family who were right over here. My mother made the drive in, so it's good to see her. She's always supported me throughout the years in anything that I've decided to do. Even if that happens to be yelling from the bleachers, get up, you're not really hurt during a sport event. But seriously, her hard work, her work ethic, especially throughout these last few years, is something that's very inspiring. And she's always been there for any tough decision throughout life. So thank you, Mom. I've got my mother and father-in-law here, Bart and Cynthia. They just live a few minutes away at Midway, so it's nice having them here to support me as well. And then, of course, I can't, I'd be remiss without mentioning my wife, Lauren, who's a graduate of Central Methodist as well. Over the last few years of being married, I guess only 1.5 years being married, but dating her before that, she's really changed what the perspective of what purpose is in life, so thanks, baby. So now, enough with the mushy stuff. Let's get on with the show, all right? We've got the thank yous away. So I've been asked to do 3 things tonight, okay? One is to give a background story on who I am, where I came to be. Second is provide value to you, both in the audience and to this lecture series. And then third, ask or answer any questions that you field for me tonight. So all of you extra credit people, it's pretty simple. I need to start with a bit of framework in the context of who I am, because we can't quite figure out where I am or where we're going to be going with this lecture without getting into the past a bit. So a little bit about my history: middle-class family, kind of country raised. My mom, she's the youngest of 13 kids. Dad, only child. A bit of a stark contrast there. Pretty crazy dynamic in terms of, social or family functions going on one side versus the other. As for me, I'm a middle child. I've got an older brother, Matt. He's down in Alabama. He's only 13 months older than me. So growing up, we were right there side by side with each other. I've got a younger brother, Coulter. He's 4 years behind me. We had a fantastic childhood, riding bikes around, playing in the creek, fishing, barbecues. I sang choir for a little bit, but don't ask me to do that because I lost that skill in puberty. So, but moving on to high school, I wasn't, we talked about, I was okay at sports, but I was an academic All-American and a member of honor societies and things like that. But in high school, I looked it up. I had a 2.7 GPA in high school. So nothing outstanding there whatsoever. And part of that was I thought it was a good idea to take AP classes early to get a head start on college. And with that, I probably wasn't ready. I was also spread far too thin with different things that I was involved in. So sports year-round, clubs, Mr. UHS, male beauty pageant that I was a part of. But I also tried to have a social life. It's probably a failure at that too. But I was always down on myself because compared to a lot of my peers, especially in those AB classes, I didn't feel like I quite had what it took to be successful academically. And especially when it came to math, I need to tell this quick story. My brother versus me. My brother Matt, he's very smart. Especially when it came to math. And I remember him vividly getting into an argument with his math teacher at the time in high school. He said, "Why do I need to do homework? I haven't gotten below a 95% on any single one of my tests. There's no reason for me to do homework." Which, some of the professors in the room might be gasping right now at that notion. But me, on the other hand, the dots didn't connect for me in math at all. And I remember spending, I get the concepts when the teacher would explain it to me. I go home, get about halfway through the homework, and then as the homework starts to progress a little bit harder, I'd be lost. The next morning I wake up, still lost, test time, lost. But when it came to things like history class, government, speech, debate, drama, those were subjects I excelled in. And so I started to double down on my strengths quite a bit. Of course you have to have a baseline of things that you're not good at, but if you double down on your strengths, I found that you can surely succeed despite some of your shortcomings. So while this was going on, remember I was involved in sports. I was best at baseball. My favorite sport was basketball, but somehow I ended up playing football here at CMU, so you figure that out. I had a couple of larger universities interested in me, but I got hurt the very first game of my senior year of high school. So any of that interest was lost at that point because there was question whether I'd actually even be able to play again. And Central was one of 3 schools that stuck with an offer. And so academically, I had no chance of getting a scholarship or a grant, so I had to rely on athletic abilities to further my education. And so I remember my visit to Central. It was during the winter, and if you've been here long enough, you know those days. It's dark, cloudy, gray out, blistering wind coming up over this hill right here, and snow on the ground. I just wanted to get back inside to one of the buildings, and I met with my friend, my first initial advisor there, Dr. Brett Meyer in the back, and we kind of selected political science as that was one of my strengths. And with that, he said, "Hey, let me take you across the hall real quick. I'm going to introduce you to your political science advisor." And you met him earlier, Dr. Carter. And I remember this. I wanted to be a sports agent because I wasn't good enough athlete to be a professional athlete, but I wanted to do something in the sports realm. And so pre-law studies, he's like, "Let me go introduce you to Dr. Carter." So talking to him, I remember this conversation, and he started to mention it earlier at dinner. And he said, "Chris, just so you know, I require all of my political science majors to take the honor variation of my American history class." And I go, "Okay, here we go again. I'm going to get it over my head with difficult courses." And he said, "Look, I understand, but the base requirements are not much different than the regular class. Instead of writing a 10-page paper, you have to write a 20-page paper. So welcome to college." So again, it wasn't anything crazy, but I found out as each time I re-enrolled in classes each semester, he kept slipping an honors class in there, no matter what, who was the instructor. And that's how I came to be an honors graduate here. And I didn't even know I was going to be one until, he kind of was sneaky and slipping all those in there. So my first semester of college was a lot of work with the prerequisites. They weren't quite holding all of my interest, but I worked really hard. And I didn't want to make the same mistake I made in high school. I made sure that I didn't get involved in some of the fantastic groups and organizations that were here on campus, because I spread myself too thin before. I want to focus on academics and athletics, which is what I did. So midterms come around right about this time, right? I know you all have midterms coming up. I had a straight A's the first time since 7th grade. Straight A's. I was like, whoa, maybe I can do this. End of the semester came around. I still held that 4.0, and I was like, okay, I can do this college thing if I focus in. And so as the years went on, I found my groove. Like I said, I was in some of those honors classes. I progressed in football, and I started having the confidence to join some of the groups. He mentioned some of them, but if any of my friends from Tau Kappa Epsilon are in here, I was president of that. I was able to join the improv group that Bill Cott comes back and does each fall. That was a lot of fun. I even had I even presented at regionals for Students in Free Enterprise, so SIFE. I was all over the board doing all kinds of things once I found my groove here. And then of course on random Sunday afternoons after a football game or something like that, poor Dr. Carter had to sit in a room with me while I filled out law school admissions tests, which I finally I did take one, but I never went to law school, so sorry for making me sit through that, Dr. Carter. As you mentioned, I was all-conference and academic all-conference and academic all-American on the football team. I mean, I started as a tight end, but I wasn't good enough to be a regular all-American or all-conference. I was academic, which I was a little bit more proud of based on my background. But the reason I'm telling you all this is Central Methodist is small, and I've gone on, I've got my master's, but I would not have succeeded in college if it wasn't for the access to the professors and to the facilities like we have here at Central. It's very unique, dynamic. Being at other universities, you don't have that. You don't have the access to professors like that, so make sure you utilize them. That's just a quick little tip. Now I need to come back to that funny story that I mentioned about Dr. Bradley. So moving into my senior year, I had my honors thesis, which meant whenever I defended my thesis, I had to give that in front of all the heads of the departments, as well as the president at the time, who was Dr. Inman. And so I had Dr. Bradley for a modern history course, which was all fine and dandy. I loved that course, but I didn't have much interaction with him other than that. And so I turned in my first draft of my thesis. And a few days later, he reported back to me, hey, Chris, I finished reading what you have here. Come and see me. So I sat down. Look on his face wasn't the best look. He handed me the paper. He said, Chris, I don't think this is quite CMU honors graduate work. And he handed it to me. And he might as well dipped that thing in a pool of red ink. I mean, it was bad. It was ugly. But I felt a little discouraged at the time. I was like, oh man, I've got a semester and a half left. I've written multiple papers that I thought were high quality, but it turns out he was kind of teaching me a little bit of a lesson. He was challenging me to step up my game a little bit but really buckle down and take something that was thoroughly critiqued and adapt it to something that was worthy of being a CMU honors graduate. And so thank you, Dr. Bradley, for putting me through that, but it really taught me a lot. And if I wasn't challenged like that, especially in my senior year, I don't think that it would have been nearly as, I guess, redeeming or as much of an honor for me to present that as it was. So post-graduation, I bounced around a bit, but I landed in Jefferson City. And I started my master's program, right? And that's a public administration program through Mizzou. And I needed, since I didn't have a whole lot of experience, I needed an internship, which it's funny because the gentleman who offered me that internship with U.S. Congress is sitting right over here, right up front. And so I appreciate that. But that internship turned into a district field representative position. And so essentially what that position is, and I've been talking, I'm not even clicking through this. We fought a lot to get this up here today. Let me click through this. And now we're going backwards here. This is why I barely ever use these. So here we go. Advocacy everywhere. Hey, there I am. And there's Dr. Carter and I, graduation, spring 2009. And there's me graduating MPA. So now we're on to work history, right? Essentially what my role was as a field representative was to be the first point of contact for anyone regarding federal issues with the U.S. government by way of Congress. So I would go out, talk to individual groups. They would come to me in office, speak to me about any type of issue or recommendation that they have for the federal government. And I would report that back to the staffer in D.C., whoever the legislative director was, or directly to the congresswoman. And I would report back to them. So I was kind of the middleman in terms of anything regarding the federal government there. And so I learned a lot about advocacy there because people would come to me and advocate on their own behalf and about all kinds of topics. You think of any type of federal issue and it was there. But later on, little did I know, a group who were advocating directly to me. There would be a federal political coordinator, an FPC, from the Realtors that would always stop in every few months. And I developed a good relationship with them. And little did I know I would be working for the Realtors just a few years later. So 3 years with US Congress, and then I took my current role. And so I work with the Missouri Realtors. So if you are a Realtor, just here in Fayette, right, you are a member of the Central Missouri Board of Realtors. And there's various, I think there's 34 in the state of Missouri. There's Columbia Board of Realtors, Jefferson City, Springfield. They've all got them, okay? And you are also a member of the Missouri Realtors. So local level, state level, and you're also a member of the National Association of Realtors. So my role is essentially similar to what the field rep was for U.S. Congress, and only this time I'm on the other side of the fence. I'm advocating to elected officials. I am training realtors to speak up on their own behalf and about issues that are important to them to elected officials at the local level, so city government, county government, state, and all the way up to the federal level. So one thing I'm going to be referencing this quite a bit is the Amendment 4 campaign from 2016. Does anybody remember that at all? There might be some people. It's called the Taxpayer Protection Amendment. So we had a large part with that. Essentially what the Taxpayer Protection Amendment, Amendment 4 of 2016, is sought to amend the Missouri State Constitution to prohibit any future state and local governments from imposing a new sales tax or use tax on services. Now Missouri does not typically have sales taxes on services, but some legislators and political donors had fought throughout the last decade or so, I'd say more like 8 years, so they could eliminate Missouri's income tax and start expanding the state's sales tax, okay? But the way they were wanting to do that was imposing the sales tax first and then worry about getting rid of the income tax later. And the Realtors decided to oppose this. So it took a combined grassroots effort from various groups within the coalition to achieve this goal. So Missouri Realtors led the charge for 2 reasons. One was because of our membership base, which is about 22,000 members. That's a lot of voters throughout the state. Second is because of our funding. We have one of the largest PACs in the world. And so we were able to do a lot with our PAC, with our dues dollars to put in towards a campaign. And keep in mind, 2016, that's a presidential election, so media buys, if you're going to buy anything on the media, so social media, radio, or TV, it's astronomical the amount that it's inflated on a presidential election year. So I'm going to start delving into some of the keys for that. So now we're getting on to the main point of the topic. So advocacy everywhere, lessons learned from influencing public policy. So we've covered my background, we're brought up to speed, right? First, let's set some parameters. I've mentioned advocacy a couple of times. So what is advocacy? It's important to start with, I think, the original meaning because it really lays it out pretty plainly. The word advocacy actually comes from the Latin word advocare, okay? And it is literally translated to call out for support. So calling out in support for something, someone, okay? It dates back to the ancient Rome and Greece periods when orators would perform as advocates, specifically for pleading someone's case. You can think of personalities such as Cicero or Caesar. They're some of the greatest Roman lawyers and advocates from their day. And I pulled this from my time during my master's studies from Ritu R. Sharma. Okay, so she's from the Academy of Educational Development. And she describes advocacy a little bit more plainly. And for this purpose, I think it's great. So she says, advocacy is putting a problem on the agenda, okay? Providing a solution to that problem, and then building support for acting on both that problem and solution. So it expresses an important idea here. And I think that, especially in a digital and a networking age, advocacy is not just about influencing public policy, but also, and first and foremost nowadays, I think it's about influencing public opinion. You control the public opinion, you can control the policy, okay? Effective advocacy enables people to help shape public debate on things. So if you're shaping that public debate, you're going to control a lot of what happens behind the scenes. It encompasses a broad range of activities. So that's why it's very difficult for people to define what I do on a day-to-day basis. The ongoing joke between my best friend and my brother is they have absolutely no idea what I do because I'll post something on Facebook about an event I'm at, and then I'm speaking to a legislator the next day, and then I'm doing a fundraiser the next day. And they're always posting, if I make a post, they'll be the first ones guaranteed to post, and what the heck is this? So these broad range of activities includes research, public education is a big one, lobbying, voter education, funding. So all these things combined together influence public policy. So besides being extremely broadly defined, it's also surrounded by several myths, and I'll briefly touch on them. So advocacy, one of the myths is advocacy is only for professional lobbyists, which if you think about it, all lobbying is advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. So we've got one of our lobbyists here. His job is very centered on talking to elected officials directly. Meanwhile, mine is more so of the public, the public opinion on things and teaching our membership how to speak and lobby on their own behalf. Another one is, advocacy is just walking down the street with a bullhorn or doing a demonstration. While yes, this is another type of activism, is a type of advocacy. But once again, it's only a single part of that. So you got to keep, and I've got multiple examples here, but I'm going to skip forward. Essentially, all the myths that I can come up with, it's only a singular part of advocacy, and it's not, it's the concept in its entirety. So in terms of Missouri Realtors, how we perform advocacy is via the Missouri Realtor Party. So, your standard two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. Those are the standard parties that you think of, but that's not us. We're the Realtor Party, so we go beyond traditional party lines and only focus on real estate, property rights, home ownership, things of that nature. And I think it's important that we do this. If you look at what our PAC invests money into candidates, when they invest money into candidates, on a national scale, it's within 2%. Of one side or the other in terms of investments. So it's pretty down the middle, which rubs some people the wrong way when we get to one person, but you have to realize, where does that candidate stand on issues that involve the Realtor Party? And I'll get into the investment a little bit later. But we're the voice for real estate in Missouri, and again, locals, so Central Missouri Board of Realtors, they cover this territory, they're the voice for real estate in this area. We encourage realtors to speak on behalf of realtors themselves, but also their clients. Our goal is to encourage multiple things, but at the forefront, it's home ownership, small business, and foster a vibrant real estate sector. And we do this, and I've mentioned it shortly, but it's act, invest, make an impact. So three-pronged: act, invest, make an impact. So if we're going to look at act, how do realtors act when it comes to advocacy? Well, we take action through the Realtor Party, and essentially they're the strongest when they speak with one voice. And that's my job, is to train them up and teach them how to speak to, give them the talking points to speak to elected officials. If realtors don't get involved to shape a discussion for any type of public policy regarding home ownership, private property rights, someone else will. Just a quick example, I'm from Columbia. One of my first weeks on the job, they came to me and asked about if I had any information on point-of-sale sidewalk repairs. And most people in here probably won't know what that is. But in a quick summary, if I sell my house to Dr. Carter, our realtor is going to have to go to the city, get a permit, they're going to come out and inspect it, okay? And after they inspect it, if they deem that it needs to be repaired, one of us it's going to have to be written in the contract, one of us is going to repair that before the house can be sold. Okay, so obviously being from a realtor's perspective and a home ownership perspective, having one of the buyers or the sellers have to repair that sidewalk beforehand, before that transaction can take process, is going to hinder private property sales and homeownership rights. So we sent out the information we got from the National Association. We got a white paper back in about a week, and we were able to go to the city council meeting and say why that's bad. So right now there's no city council discussion about point of sale sidewalk repairs. So that's the bright and the fun and interesting stuff I get to do. But part of that, if they didn't have their ears to the ground, people in Columbia might be having to repair their sidewalks before they sell their homes, which is publicly owned property. So they stay informed on local, state, and federal government issues. Many realtors sit on city councils, or they attend them. Many of them are on planning and zoning commissions. They vote in every election very strongly. 85% of realtors are elected to vote. We'd like to get that up a little bit over 90%. They respond to call for actions at the local, state, and federal levels, and they communicate very well with their elected officials. Like I said, I had a relationship with the realtors well before I joined them. So now we have ACT taken care of. Now we go on to invest, and this goes into the Political Action Committee. So the Realtors Political Action Committee, RPAC. And this is where, I think PACs get quite a bad name, but essentially what we do is we do candidate screenings throughout the state. We find realtor champions. They might be realtors, but just because they are a realtor, they're not necessarily getting PAC money. They have to align with realtor rights, property rights, and home ownership. Again, our PAC is nonpartisan. We're nearly 50-50 between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Candidates receive support or not selected based on any other views other than what we are looking at. So we have ACT, we have Invest, now make an impact. This is the fun part of the job. The Realtor Party executes plans of action to move forward to advocate on behalf of their industry. Issues such as the transfer tax, property insurance, short-term rentals. Who knows what short-term rentals, the debate is on that? Anybody? You ever hear of Airbnb? So that's a highly contested thing within cities and counties. And every single, if you take, Lake of the Ozarks, it's completely different than St. Louis on how they're going to be tackling this issue, which is completely different than Branson area, different than Columbia. And you got to think of it from this way, from private property rights. If I have a condo and I'm using that on Airbnb, it's my property, I can do what I want with it, right? But now, let's say 15 people have rented that out. My neighbors might not like that so much. They might not appreciate 10 cars in the driveway. They might not appreciate the potential security risk of someone that is just renting that out for a weekend. They might have small kids, and the party's keeping them up at night. So you have two dueling sides here of private property rights that are going on. How are we going to facilitate that? So those are some of the type of things that we look at. So that's how at Missouri Realtors we kind of tackle advocacy, act, invest, and make an impact. So now if we're looking at how we're going to move forward with a successful advocacy plan, we're going to have to come up with a couple of things and these are put in my own words here, so they're quite eloquent. What's the problem? Who's involved? How will this work? And how do we do? I think I broke that down pretty nicely myself, but if we're looking at first, what's the problem? So if we're trying to define a problem, right? It's essentially, in technical terms, problem and issues analysis, and moving from that, you're going to have to do strategic planning. Okay, but I like what's the problem a little bit better. Essentially, what you're going to have to do is define the problem and find its root causes. So for instance, if I have knee pain, right? That could be due to a multitude of things. It could be, an actual hip issue or an ankle or a foot issue, or maybe it's the way I run or an overuse issue. You have to find the root causes of whatever the problem is in order to treat the surface symptoms, right? And so that's what, a problem and issue analysis is. Simply asking why. Why is it the way it is it's a very simple process, but it works to identify underlying reasons and root causes. It examines a problem by asking questions to find out what caused that issue. And like I said, most problems are multifactorial. It's just not a binary thing. It's not black and white. And what I mean by this is multiple solutions are going to be available for multiple problems. And if we can continue to ask why, and find, go multiple layers deep and find the root cause of an issue, it's going to be much better than us just putting a patch on something for the short term, which seems to be a trend if you look at politicians, especially if politicians are on a term limit. They want to get in, show how well they did for a brief period, and now look at the long-term lasting effects. And there might be unintended consequences in there to some of the actions on policies that get pushed through. So if we're taking time to envision outcomes during the strategic planning session, it's very important. And campaigns are notoriously ambitious in their planning, and their progress are very, I'd say, unpredictable in their long-term nature, all making it difficult to choose which level of outcome you want to focus on. And a big thing is also timing is key. And I'm going to go back to the Amendment 4 campaign. So in our Taxpayer Protection Amendment, timing is key. For the previous years, we had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to prevent any future sales taxes on services because the timing wasn't right for us to go on to the offensive. And finally, in around mid-2015, the Realtors decided that they wanted to finally make a move on this to prevent any future sales taxes on services. But if they would have tried in prior years, it would have been defeated really quick. And it took time during that issue analysis to weigh our expertise that we had as a staff, as a realtor base, and our capacity to actually move forward with that. Our advocacy department had expanded. We had a stronger advocacy hold on the local levels, and funding from the national, state, and local levels had pretty much peaked at that point, so we could actually afford to do so instead of just wasting our money. Another important thing, we need to see that the solution actually does exist and there are practical opportunities for us to do so. So that goes back into the actually being able to pay for something. So I kind of briefly outlined how important it is to identify the root cause of the problem and develop an understanding of the ways of drafting a path moving forward. So now we need to take a look at who's involved. And so we're going to be mapping out the internal and external environment. So we're going to see who the players are that we're going to be involved with. So to better understand external and internal forces that influence our strategic issues, the better we understand those, the more likely our effort is going to reach that desired result that we want to achieve at the end. So when thinking about external forces, don't just consider how they impact you and your organization, but you also have to think broadly, think how might they might affect campaign beneficiaries, organizations, the donors, as well as other players in the field. But how will these important stakeholders also be impacted, and what are their responses going to be? Their responses are key. So typical groups with power and influence, you can rattle them off, but politicians, civil servants, faith organizations, businesses, lawyers, judges, professors even, the media is a big one, and how they react to what you're trying to move forward with. So from the above list, we have to identify those that may be interested in our issue and evaluate their role, identify those who might be adversely impacted, and find out who has constraints about the campaign that you want to run. So you can kind of break them down into four categories, I think. So targets, so those are the decision makers, or people who have influence over decision makers, the constituents, the people you work for, and the people who are expected to benefit from your advocacy campaign, your allies, so your coalition that you're building in the process, and your opponents. Of course, those are always important. You want to know who they are. So mapping that out, so your allies is particularly helpful in a coalition building. So for the Amendment 4 campaign, we had a coalition of well over 50 different organizations, which is fantastic. And we chose them fairly strategically, but we were also looking for as large of a coalition as possible. You got to think, we're the realtors, but we have the home builders, we have the bankers, we have the broadcast association, we have multiple other organizations that were involved in our campaign, but even though we were spearheading it, because sales taxes on services impacted them as well. So building that coalition, and also you kind of want to look at, and I'll talk about this in just a moment when I talk about the next section, but you also need to know who those opponents are and what they're doing behind the scenes. Are they going to invest millions of dollars to combat your campaign? That's going to increase your costs. You better have that stockpiled as well. So those are all the types of things that you need to look at. Next step is going to be, if I go the correct way, there we go. There we go. How will this work? So this is going to be your lobbying, your influencing, the real heart and soul of advocacy work. Now, it's time to think about selecting the right tools to achieve our goals. So like I said, we have a large advocacy team. We had the grassroots effort from our membership. Realtors have plenty of sign locations, right? We had the funding in place. We also had to pick out our coalition, and we had to be very strategic about that. So you got to think, what's going to make people change their minds? Have you ever gotten into a political debate on Facebook? It doesn't usually work out too well. People end up doubling down on their point of view. It's probably not going to sway their mind. So you've got people who are just going to be completely against you. You've got people who are undecided on an issue, and you've got people that support your issue. So the big thing with that is actually mobilizing those people that are with you. They might agree with you 100%, but if they're agreeing with you 100% and they don't go vote on something, or they don't show up for a rally to get media exposure, it's going to be fruitless. There's going to be no point in it. So you actually have to mobilize those that support you and sway those ones that you can sway. The opponents, it might not work out so well for them. But so in short, reach out to the undecideds with awareness activities, rally those that share your views, and initially avoid those that might be opposed to you. I can remember even running political campaigns. An incumbent, if you listen to incumbents speak, they're routinely going to say my opponent until their opponent might get good enough name recognition to be worthy of the incumbent actually speaking their opponent's name. They'll just say, my opponent believes this, my opponent believes that. And it's just a little trick that people use because they don't want to even acknowledge their opponents until it's needed. So take a note of all the above actions, and they're built on the basis of communication. That's absolute key. Effective communication is going to change perceptions and achieve any social change. In general, successful advocacy communication requires clear objectives, knowledge of the intended audience. The audience is going to change your messaging quite a bit, and language appropriate for that audience. And you got to keep the content short and specific. You can do that through flyers, through social media, public meetings, the media, petitions. All that list, you got to put all that together to formulate a plan, and each plan has to be specialized to the audience that's going to be presented to. So next, the last step. So our campaign, let's say we have a successful campaign, right? How do we do? I know I earlier said, I noted that campaigns are very ambitious in what they want to achieve. And let's say you do achieve even 90%, 80%, 75% of those goals. If you don't evaluate the actual impact of that goal, of what you've achieved, what's the point? Maybe you created something that doesn't even get used. Maybe you spent millions of dollars on a campaign and no one's utilizing the programs that you created. Okay, so you need to have program evaluation. So you can maybe we need to increase consumer education after we've already passed through this piece of legislation. So I think the key to doing that is your outcomes run the danger of being too activity focused. So you have a checklist of things. If you make them outcome focused, so if you almost reverse engineer it and make it outcome driven, that activity focus will come on its own. If you're outcome focused, you're much more likely to look at the impact of those activities. I uttered the term unintended consequences earlier. And again, that you see that a lot whenever people who are in office create a policy for the short term for their own gain, whether it's to make their constituents happy, to make a promise to a donor that they're going to fulfill. The long-term impact of some of these programs could be detrimental, or they could be great. I don't know. I don't want to be all doom and gloom here. Some measures that you can use to define those outcome successfulness or not would be policy gains, implementation gains, democratic gains. So how you fare in your reelection, or in terms of us, how we foster relationships with elected officials going on. Civil society gains, how the public perceives you, and if they think you do good work. Did it benefit the community as we wanted it to? And then partnership gains, those coalitions mean a lot whenever you're looking at long-term execution of future endeavors that you want to put forward. So now, hopefully powered by knowledge, the act, invest, make an impact, my brief synopsis of what's the problem, who's involved, how will this work, how do we do. You kind of get a little bit of insight onto what I do on a daily basis, on a yearly basis. So essentially, what have we learned? You're going to have to trust the process. I looked this up and I thought it was kind of interesting. In a Brookings Institute survey of 100 campaigns, the most important element of success boils down to one basic piece of advice, and that's don't skip steps. Everybody has their own way of implementing a successful campaign, but you can't skip the steps. You can't go from day 1 to day 150 without having that middle ground there. You got to clarify those goals. You have to match the strategy to the environment. Make sure the timing's right, make sure the funding right, make sure the coalition's right. You need to select those winning tactics. There's hundreds of possible ways that you can move forward, and each individual campaign is completely different. But it's important not to skip those steps and stick to those tactics. Even if you don't succeed, you have to learn from those tactics that you used, how to implement them in the future, and try to change your campaign up for the next time around. And the best way to lose is to never really give up. As I said, we played defense on sales tax on services for many years, and it looks like the other side wasn't going to give up. So we had to go on the offensive and change up our tactics. We thought thwarting them with our dollars for years and years on end was going to be enough to keep them away from trying to change the tax law, but it wasn't working. So we had to do something about it. Even if your major policy change is secured, as I just mentioned, the most successful advocates never say, mission accomplished. They don't say that. They continue the education of the public. There's always more work to do. A policy win is literally just the tip of the iceberg in terms of a successful advocacy campaign. Now, bear with me before I get to questions and answers here. Okay, I'm going to tell a quick story. And the story is going to get a little weird. So those of you that are sleeping or passed out, this is going to be a little bit entertaining. So it's derived from an old Indian folktale. And it's been updated just a little bit. So there's a story about a teacher, right? And this teacher is very intelligent. She is the smartest person in the entire town. I mean, parents even come to her to ask her questions. The kids, every single day, they try to come up with a new riddle or a trick question to get her. She's always able to answer those questions correctly. And that's up until Johnny came to her class. We'll call him Johnny for the time being. Johnny was very smart. He was very witty, and he challenged the teacher every day. He got a riddle book. He looked through that riddle book and tried to ask her a new question every single morning. And it drove him crazy because he's used to being the smartest kid around, but here, someone is his superior. His teacher is his superior. And so Johnny goes home. He's tossing and turning at night. What am I going to do tomorrow to try to stump the teacher? It's late at night. He's thinking. He's like, okay, I think I finally got it. And so he wakes up early the next morning, goes down to the creek behind his house. He's looking around, looking under rocks, looking behind bushes, and he finally sees a frog. He picks up that frog, and he puts it in a box and takes that frog to school, okay? He goes to his friends. He said, hey, come here. I finally got her. I'm going to get her, all right? He opens up the box, puts that frog behind his back, goes up to the teacher, says, teacher, I bet you can't guess what's behind my back. And it's kind of a trick question. The teacher's like, okay, no one's able to guess that. That's impossible. But just then, the frog croaked, ribbit. So the teacher's like, oh, you got a frog behind your back. And Johnny's like, dang it, that's bad timing on my part. But wait, Johnny's quick-witted, right? So he comes up with a plan, and he said, teacher, it gets a little gross at this part, but teacher, I bet you can't guess whether the frog's alive or dead. Now remember, the frog just croaked, so obviously it's alive, right? The teacher was kind of stumped. She's like, that frog has to be alive, or someone just riveted behind Johnny. I don't know what had just happened. But then the teacher thought a little bit. So here's what was going on in Johnny's head. If the teacher answered, yes, the frog's alive, Johnny wasn't the nicest kid. He was going to crush that frog and say, no, the teacher, the frog is dead. But if the teacher answered, the frog is dead, well, sorry, teacher, the frog's alive. And so the teacher figured this out. She knew the trick that Johnny was going to play. And she said, Johnny, I don't know whether that frog is alive or dead, but the answer is in your hands. And Johnny was like, well, that's a silly answer. And then she said, no, Johnny, listen to me. The answer is in your hands. And Johnny thought about that for a little bit more, And he thought, oh, the decision is literally in my hands. I make the choice. So you got to think, the way that odd story ties back into advocacy, you have leaders in DC, you have leaders in Jefferson City, right? No doubt the decisions that they make are important. They impact your lives greatly. But if you really want to make changes, if you really want to make the choices that impact your life, it starts with the grassroots campaign. It starts with advocacy, okay? Your decisions, the choice is in your hands to move forward. And so if you think about that story, please skip the bad parts about the frog, the things that could have potentially happened to it. But remember from this talk, change is in your hands, choice is in your hands. And that's pretty much all I have to say tonight. I'm glad you're here to see a little bit what I do. I really appreciate the opportunity to come back and speak. So I'm here to field any questions if anyone cares to answer or cares to ask them. I'll do my best to answer. It's up to you. It can be about my job. It can be about my time here. It can be about anything other than that. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. And questions, anybody? Once again, I appreciate it, everyone. I'll be up here hanging out with a couple of my family members and former professors if you want to come say hi or speak a little bit.
We may still have questions.
Oh, you might still have questions, okay.
We just wanted to clap.
Oh, if you want to clap, fantastic. Does anybody have questions? I'm here, yes.
What is the current issue for the election in the next few weeks? What are you guys advocating?
Yeah, so for us, actually, it's quite timely. There's Proposition D. We're not spearheading that, but Proposition D is a multifaceted proposition. So we had an amendment that we spearheaded that through petition, right? But proposition's been passed through the state level in the House and the Senate, and it gets put on the ballot. So Proposition D has multiple things going on. First, it originated as a proposition to prevent any taxing of Olympians, Paralympians, for any of their winnings that they have. So if someone goes to the Olympics, they win. Currently, they can be taxed on their winnings. So that's step one. Step two is it's essentially the gas tax. It's going to be going up by 2.5 cents over the next few years until 2020, and that is going to be a funding mechanism for the State Highway Patrol, because currently they get their funding from the Highway Patrol. So that's going to secure funding directly for the Missouri State Highway Patrol, and anything past that has been designated for roads and bridges. And you can go online and see how that money is going to be allotted. Each county has a certain percentage that they get from the gas tax. Missouri's got one of the largest road infrastructures in the nation, and it's got one of the lowest gas taxes. So the disparity is absolutely ridiculous in our opinion, because if we're wanting to grow Missouri, if we're wanting to attract businesses here, one of the prime things that attracts them is our ability to ship things over the roads and railways. But if our roads are crumbling, it doesn't matter. It's not going to attract them. If school buses can't even get over specific bridges in various counties, I mean, I think there's 1,000 bridges that can't are due to be closed because they can't be utilized. Because they deteriorated so much. So that gas tax is going towards that. As realtors, the vote was to support that, because obviously no one wants to drive around on roads that you can't drive around. It harms property values. It harms, like I said, fostering small business is one of our, and large businesses. Commercial business is a whole different side of the realtor organization. But commercially, it hinders us as an association. So that's why we're making a financial contribution and again a membership contribution to a proposition. Again, we're not spearheading it, but there's others that are spearheading it. So that's one of the big issues that we're keeping an eye on. And of course, who are we going to be talking to in DC? Who are we going to be talking to locally as well? We're always keeping an eye on who those people are. But that's the big issue that we're going to be dealing with. Yes.
Do you know what Missouri's position is on the tiny house movement?
We don't specifically have, in terms of, I don't know about Missouri as the general feel as a state. I know that it's a new thing. I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock into it. I know in Kansas City, the Realtors are involved in a project there to provide tiny houses, an entire tiny house community for homeless veterans. So obviously we support that, but in terms of a value of a tiny house right now, I think it's just still too new to know whether, let's say I purchase a teeny tiny piece of land and I build a tiny home on it, is that actually going to increase the value of that property? Maybe, maybe not, I don't know.
What I mainly meant was, is it like legal to do so?
Oh, yeah, in certain places, yes, and that's going to depend on each individual city, much like I was mentioning with short-term rentals for like Airbnb. Each different city, even a homeowners association might have a different viewpoint on it. So that's going to change from community to community, but certainly, like I said, there's a whole community of them in Kansas City, which is fantastic. I know Columbia is not too keen on them, from where I'm from, but they certainly have tried it. You know, I think there's one that's even built on the back of a flatbed trailer to get around the rules currently, and I think they're making more rules to do away with that because they don't want a tiny house sitting on their streets. But I mean, it's all individually based.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Yes.
So some of the bonus points are here for an environmental science class.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering if there are some issues related to healthy environments that the Missouri Realtors have been involved with.
I'm trying to think of one. You got one off the top of your head? I don't have one any locally. Again, that's what I deal with. I might be able to speak on it though.
Environmental hazards, I mean, we don't want any environmental hazard standards that are higher than federal level.
Right, yeah, so speaking on that just a little bit, we try not to impact property rights or home ownership more than what's needed to, because there's always a delicate balance of environmental studies, environmental impacts on a specific building, especially when you get into the commercial side of things. But at the same point, we also believe in private property rights, and that's a tight rope to walk if you think about the community benefit versus an individual person's benefit. And then you get into, you know, what is, to a philosophical point of view of what is an individual's right over, you know, public goods, whether that's, you know, running water, things like that. So we try not to go too far over the standards, as he said, for the federal limits.
All right.
All right, thank you all. I appreciate it.
Free punch